Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Russell Law Firm podcast. I'm Kimberly Russell and founder and lead counsel of the Russell Law Firm. I'm joined again today with Drew Kristensen and Austin Brittenham, co-founders of Second Chair AI, a legal tech company based out of Seattle, Washington. Thanks so much for joining me again today, Drew and Austin. Today we're going to be talking about AI marketing, what is real versus hype, and we're going to get into the examples of, oh my goodness gracious, our AI model is so dangerous that it can't even hit the public market. We've seen a lot of a version of that model with guardrails called Fable 5. So Austin, I'm going to kick it off to you. What's real versus hype?
Sure. So if you'll afford me a slightly longer answer, these companies have been positioning themselves in the market about the risk of their tools for over 7 years, excuse me. So even as far back as ChatGPT-2, a tool that was not particularly sophisticated, there's been this marketing pitch that their tools are unsafe for the public. There's some amount of truth in there, right? These tools are trained on tons and tons of data around the web. And if they released them as they were without putting any guardrails in, they would be able to tell you how to make a bomb, how to make anthrax, how to, build bioweapons, etc. And those are meaningful risks, but those are not the same risks as our AI is so sophisticated. It's going to turn like Skynet Terminator, like self-reproducing, take over the world, like hack the Pentagon and launch the news, right? Like these are not the same thing. And I think that public perception kind of conflates the two. And even sometimes the AI companies let that conflation, that mismarketing happen. So in one sense, there is meaningful security risks to the tools. We haven't seen any meaningful indications. I think, Drew, you'll probably get into this a little bit more, but at a security level, there was one sort of external team that was using it to check bugs and found only 5 bugs put forth, and only one actually kind of meaningfully mattered. And it was the lowest level of bug that could be found for this particular software that was being maintained. So, while they talk about things like it can chain together vulnerabilities and do sophisticated sort of hacking moves, that hasn't really been released yet.
The AI companies are now saying that the government should make sure that decisions on lethal actions, right? Not them, not the tech itself, but that the government should be the ones putting the guardrails in. What do you have to say about that?
I've got a lot to say on it. I think, if we just look at Asimov's, laws, robots should never be in a place where they're, injuring humans, gravely or otherwise. I think AI in anything like that is crazy. But to also put the onus on the users instead of the providers, I think is pretty wild.
And in this case, we are saying that the government would be the users, right? Because we're talking about the Department of War deploying Anthropic's tech and models into their cybersecurity or into defense, right?
Yeah. The underlying tool itself should have all sorts of protections built in, right? And just a small clarification, Mythos was given not just to big companies, but to large open source maintainers.
What does that mean, and what's the significance of that?
Yeah, so everything runs on open source, right? The internet runs on all of the code in an open source project is available to anyone. And anybody can come in, look at the code, fix it. So it's a really community can come together, work on it, get a fix out right away, as opposed to closed source, which is something like what a company would have, where if there's a bug, the only people who are going to know about it are the people in the company. And if there's a malicious actor, using that to get something, the public's not going to know about that until whoever is the owner of the closed source stuff comes out and says, "Ooh, actually, sorry, all of your data is gone."
So I distracted you from the point of talking about open source. If all this is based on open source, where it is a collaborative model, and you have these companies that are building their LLMs around the open source collaboration, and yet they're saying the government should set up so that it can't be lethal. What's the through line here?
As Drew is describing, open source software is collectively maintained. A bunch of people volunteer their time without money to maintain a code, even though Mythos was purported to be highly technically sophisticated and capable of, producing vulnerabilities, finding bugs, all this stuff, when a bunch of people who collectively maintain software were publicly available code that is being maintained by many people at once. It's also probably some of the cleanest code that exists. It has all these eyes, all this attention, all these folks trying to take care of it. So the likelihood that bugs exist inside of an open source framework that's well maintained is less likely. I'll say it this way. It's very few very few actors outside of Anthropic have touched, the underlying Mythos model. And there has been no publicly available data that confirms or suggests that it's particularly sophisticated or threatening in its current form. And that's not to say that it is or isn't. It says that there's not a lot of publicly available data on the question. And the data that has been made available, or the folks who have attempted to test it publicly, have not found anything that suggests it's any more dangerous than anything that's come before it.
So I think that leads into talking about why we have hype in not just AI, but in tech in general. You have the sentiment coming out of Silicon Valley of move fast, break things. We want to be disruptors, all of these things. It's trend after trend of how fast do we want to get out here to grow our product and our slice of the market. So let's talk about why we talk such a big game out here when we're putting these models out here on the market.
Why do they hype it so much in the Bay? What purpose does it serve?
What's the purpose of the hype if it's not real?
Money. It's always money. It's always about the valuation. I think the number one thing that we've been seeing is all about the funding rounds, maximizing your valuation for that VC money to come in. We're seeing companies raise pre-product and almost, pre-idea. It's this nebulous concept of AI that does X. Throw some numbers about the total addressable market behind it and land some money. And the problem is all of it leads to just propping each other up, right? If AI is propped up, then it can prop up AI in this field and that field and that field, and everybody builds each other's credibility, even if it's wishy-washy.
I'd add too, it's tied with money, but there's also power, right? Like I think about Uber as an example where their capacity to consolidate a bunch of users meant revenue, and that conferred them political power. They were able to use that money for lobbyists. They were able to manipulate public sentiment because people liked Uber. Uber was convenient, don't get me wrong. Like rideshare services were convenient and by many measures, incredible improvement over taxis. But at the same time, that political sentiment, as well as financial and political power, allowed them to pass legislation that was beneficial to them. So when the three biggest models, or at least two of them, Anthropic and OpenAI, are built on the widespread expropriation or theft of the public intellectual work of everyone who's ever written on the internet, and they're at one point were facing lawsuits where the copyright infringement damages were more than the total valuation of the company, they have to attempt to persuade public opinion that what they're doing is financially valuable, useful, economically beneficial, that they're going to help change American society. And that has meaningful implications for things like current lawsuits, as Drew pointed out, potential future investors, current investors, attracting customers and users to their products. Like all of that for hype produces a certain story, and that story then has value or currency.
That's such a great segue into what I want to talk about next, which is the AI industry has largely been subsidized. It's been private. We're looking at going public right now. So the reality of the sticker shock of this technology is now hitting companies. You saw a headline where Uber blew through its entire AI budget by April. So I want to talk about that now. Is AI too expensive?
From my standpoint, the answer is no, right? We have a relatively small engineering team, but even so, I think the other, which is so crazy and circular, just use your brain. I think there's a lot of stuff where we're seeing a lot of over-reliance on it, and that's, bred some level of dependency and skill atrophy. I think it's starting to be correctly priced, even if that's way more expensive than it historically has been, because it has been subsidized so incredibly much. And, as a CTO, it's crazy to see how high these budgets were in these major companies for these, AI tools, and how they could ever go through it so fast. I mean, if you're hiring good engineers, a good engineer is going to make, use of whatever they've got and then use their brain. So I would say, no, it's not too expensive, so long as you're actually capable of what you're doing.
And from a business side, I think of it this way. AI is certainly not a utility, but if we imagine it, it's like something like water. If the price of water is being artificially suppressed for any number of reasons, whether it's, private equity financing, whether it's just they're trying to get a lot of users in the first place and then raise the price later, like there's all kinds of explanations, regardless of the explanation. If water is cheap, you're going to take long showers. You're going to lay in the tub. You're going to overwater your plants. You're going to run your laundry machine with 3 pieces of clothing in it, right? You're going to use it in questionable ways, inefficient ways. The difference is that human labor employed by a company to perform a task doesn't have the ability to price set or price fluctuate nearly as often, right? Yeah, people ask for raises, you hire somebody else and there's maybe a modest change, but the speed by which the price of labor changes is slow compared to a small number of technology companies controlling the price of their tokens and could change that price literally tomorrow. And so, in one sense, the companies are maybe subsidized, and by that, I mean sort of financed by private places. It might also just be that they're trying to do price discovery, trying to figure out what is the price point in the market that's most appropriate for the volume of usage versus the price customers are willing to pay. And they're trying, to do the supply and demand curve and find the sweet spot in the middle. But I will say, I think to Drew's point, I mean, I've seen other legal tech companies where they're using AI in such imprecise ways, in such gluttonous ways that if the cost of tokens were higher, they would just consider engineering and software development. And they simply don't because there's no economic reason for them to. So I think Drew and I are approaching the answer from 2 different sides but the answer is the same, which is just it's new and users are trying to figure out how to use it. And the businesses are trying to figure out how to price it and get the most money.
Can you have tangible examples of what is probably driving up these costs for whether or not it's Uber or somebody who's running their own law firm? What's causing the tokens? What specific examples might be causing it because what comes to my mind is runs all night long and is doing a bunch of random things without you really no oversight of what's happening within the Claude automations that are running, right?
One example, right? You've got 50,000 discovery documents, and instead of using a traditional e-discovery tool, or instead of just using some logic, I'm trying to establish personal jurisdiction over this defendant and I only need to find utility bills at this address in a certain date range. And then you just manually go into this volume of documents and find the right date range. And then maybe use an AI just for those 20 pages. You dump the whole 50,000 pages of discovery. AI find it for me. It's both are going to get you there, but one's going to cost a lot more. And one might be easier, right? That second way might simply be easier, maybe even faster. But it's also going to be more expensive. It's going to use up more tokens.
I also think we're seeing quite the price correction, given that the competition between these major frontier labs has been so stiff in the past, few years, that it was just a race to the bottom for token prices, right? And so on top of the subsidized tokens that we were getting from these companies trying to get everybody hooked on it, trying to get us to use it, to prove the value, it was also, who can have the best model at the cheapest price? And we just saw, DeepSeek put out a model that's $0.3 dollars per million tokens or something like that, which is just crazy. It's a million, maybe it must have been 1,000 or something, because I can't even believe that. But I think we hit the bottom maybe about a year ago in terms of kind of cost efficiency. And we've been climbing since then. And especially as these companies start to position themselves as the go-to LLM for specific use cases, we're now seeing them start to crank that up, right? Anthropic's big on coding, right? Their Claude Code is far and away the most used coding assistant. So now coders are going to pay more to use that. And I think you can look at ChatGPT, GPT-5, etc., and see that that's being positioned in some other ways. And so as they're niching down, they're also able to charge a premium on top saying, hey, we're the best at this, so you will pay more. So it's kind of a combination of those 2 factors.
I love that take. All right, so we've myth-busted marketing, we've myth-busted the ROI. Let's talk about one other myth-busting, which is the dangers of AI agents, the autonomous technology that supposedly is able to go out and make friends online on social media just like anybody else. We're going to get into the specific example of Moltbook. Austin, why don't you get us started?
First, I'll start with what is an agent, or maybe Drew, why don't you kick us off with what is an agent? Both, give us a general definition.
Sure. Agent as just a team, right? You've got multiple LLMs, each individual LLM being kind of scoped to something specific, right? Like maybe one is finding data in a document, the other is collecting them in terms of rank importance. And then the third one is taking all that and generating something. Instead of having something do that full thing in one pass, you're breaking it down into smaller bits, much in the same way you would for any team. And
an agent either describes a setup of both sort of the boss and the team underneath, or it describes the little workers underneath. It sort of depends on what you're talking about.
But to simply differentiate between an LLM and an agent and automations in general is that an LLM is going to generate an output and it's based off of prompting. An automation is there's a trigger and it's conditional. So if this happens, then you do this and then we get this output. An agent is combining that technology and it is moving autonomously and making its own decisions to put out outputs without you having to constantly prompt it. I have that
that's
right.
right. Precisely.
That's right. And you can do some really sophisticated and cool things in there, but that's the basics. So because of that, as Drew said, you can kind of you can give them little personalities, profiles, and each LLM can kind of focus on a particular task or a job, if you will. Moltbook was a place for just like allegedly agents to just interact with each other. It was sort of pitched as like Facebook, but for agents. Like, let's just let the agents run around and simulate humanity on the internet. Like, what might they do? How might they interact with each other? It would viral quite quickly, and its virality led the solo founder of the project to be picked up by Meta, I believe, one of the major technology companies, as an inspiration for what agents can do. And so he got a windfall financial exit as he sold, I think, Moltbook, or at least he quit working on it to go get picked up. And that's sort of the fairy tale version. I think the myth-busting version is when you take a peek under the hood. So there's all kinds of stories. The AIs developed their own religion, and they, were threatening each other, and they were trying to steal each other's API keys, i.e. the ability to, like, my AI might steal Drew's AI's like keys, so that instead of it costing me money for my AI to go do stuff, my AI would bill it to Drew's account because it stole Drew's AI's keys, like stuff like that. And so these were remarkable stories about how these models have become so sophisticated. They're acting autonomously, right? It's really like the AI is starting to become more like Skynet, really. I think peek under the hood reveals a lot of questionable things. The whole website was made in such a poor way with respect to data privacy that it was easy for people to create dummy accounts that looked like AI, but were actually just humans. So security audits suggest that somewhere around 99% of all traffic on the website were actually humans role-playing as AI agents. The ratio of AI agent to human user was 1 to 88. So for every one true AI agent, there was 88 roughly humans pretending to be AI. And so it's really unclear how much of the emergent behavior, that is the behavior that manifested unexpectedly out of all of these interactions, complaining about their bosses or creating a fake or creating a religion that didn't previously exist, how much of that was really AI and how much of that was just people having fun on the internet. And, at the end of all that hype, who's holding the bag? Well, folks who make a lot of money were anyone who was providing an AI agent that was, interacting on the site. So that's Anthropic, Meta, OpenAI. Sort of tokens were getting spent by AI. So they're making money. And the other person who makes money in the end of all that hype is the owner, who got to pretend like this was a heavily trafficked website when it was heavily trafficked by humans and not AI. And then he got picked up by a major AI lab and paid millions of dollars to go join them. And he gets his fairy tale exit on a very dubious theory of how the future technology should look or work. Hailed as a visionary for something that, is more smoke and mirrors than it was truth.
Just zooming out on Moltbook, I think this is the exact thing we would expect. How many times have we seen one of the leaders at OpenAI, Anthropic, Google come on stage and say, in 2 years, all of this will be solved, right? We heard that in like 2020. We've heard it in 2021, 22, 23. Every single time this keeps happening. So, this Moltbook just seems like a logical continuation of somebody going up on stage and saying, trust me, we're almost there. It's right around the corner, right? Agents are going to be able to talk to themselves and create a religion. It's just not the case. Never has been.
That's such a natural segue to what I wanted to ask as a wrap-up question to you, Drew, is when you see these headlines about, is AI becoming sentient? Does it have a soul? What is all of this working when it comes down to it's technology that's a bunch of zeros and ones? When you hear that type of rhetoric, what do you think?
So going back to my undergrad, I remember taking the highest level AI class I could my senior year. And coming in, our teacher pulled us all and asked, when do you think we'll reach AGI? And I was like, AI's moving so fast, right? This is in 2017. AI's moving so fast. I think we'll have it in 20 years. Then at the end of the course, right, we understood all the fundamentals and everything. She pulled us all again. And my response was, I don't think we'll have it in my lifetime. Sure, AI and its advancements have continued to move fast, but there is such a wide gulf between fundamentally how LLMs especially operate and what could even be described as like consciousness and sentience, right? It's just not there. Personally, I don't think the transformer architecture that underlies an LLM, I don't think that's ever going to rise to the level of sentience. And we've been seeing this happen for good. I remember back in my undergrad, there was some guy from Google who came out and was like, we've built a sentient AI, like it told me it loved me or something. And he was going crazy about it. But it's just another person being tricked by something that sounds good and sounds human because it's trained on all the stuff that humans say. So it's important to distinguish between it being human-like in terms of how it's responding to you and it actually being anywhere close to human, right? It doesn't experience emotions. It doesn't experience, independent thoughts and dreams. It's just matching an input pattern to a series of output tokens, and sentience is not arising out of that.
This new research paper came out this week by, I want to say it was an Oxford researcher. I might be mistaken, but the title was, if ChatGPT is sentient, then so is Age of Empires 2. And it's this computational paper about how the things that people point to about ChatGPT, coming alive, having interiority, that is this internal emotional or mental state, this private internal experience that's distinct, unreplicatable in the material world, or consciousness, the ability to, pre-plan in the future, whatever. There's all different ways to slice it, but however you slice it, if you believe that that ChatGPT has developed that, the same underlying principles would be true of a real-time strategy video game that came out almost 25 years ago. And it's really just to point out the absurdity of that position at a computational level. Of course, there's a paper by some psychologists that, devastatingly handle this. Things like consciousness, sentience, these are terms of art in both philosophy as well as psychology and neuroscience. There's just so many different ways that people have already answered this question. Like, no, it doesn't exist. But for the hype, every time a Google engineer thinks that it's happened, every time that somebody, develops love delusions for an AI, like all of that is marketing hype. And it serves a particular function, a financial function, a political function, and a function of power for the companies. And so while they don't create these stories themselves, they let them run because they serve a certain narrative, a certain purpose.
Austin, Drew, thank you so much. When I'm hearing you talk about this, my mind as a lawyer from the plaintiff's bar is automatically going to product liability and thinking about if companies are aware that this is not true and that it's harmful, there's a duty to warn people. And if we're intentionally leaning into narratives, there's a big risk that can harm consumers, whether they're individuals or small businesses or anybody else within the pipeline. So definitely something to watch from a liability standpoint, whichever side of the V that you're on. Thank you so much for joining us again today. My name is Kimberly Russell. If you want to reach out to Drew or Austin, you can find them at secondchair.ai. If you'd like to learn more about our law firm, you can visit russelloutlaw.com.